Have you ever felt like your life is finally calm, but somehow quietly incomplete? Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that hurts every day, but in a soft, unspoken way, like something important is missing, and you're not even sure what it is. At 55, Margaret had learned to live with that feeling. Her life wasn't bad. It was stable, safe, predictable. From the outside, everything looked complete. But inside, something had slowly changed over the years. There was a time when her home was full of life, laughter in the kitchen, voices in every room, footsteps echoing down the hallway. Every day had a purpose. Someone needed her, breakfast to prepare, school runs to manage, problems to solve, moments to hold together. She had never complained, because that was her world. She wasn't just a mother, she was the center of everything. But time has a quiet way of changing things. Slowly, almost without warning, her children grew up. They moved out, built lives of their own, chased their own dreams. And one day, the house was still the same, but the life inside it was gone. At first, it felt strange, then a little painful, and eventually, it became normal. Now her mornings were quiet. She would wake up early, walk into the kitchen, and make herself a cup of coffee. Then she would sit by the window, watching the soft morning light fill the room. No one to wake up, no one in a rush, no voices calling her name, just silence. At first, the silence had felt heavy, but over time, she learned to accept it. This is what life looks like now, she would tell herself. And she wasn't unhappy, but she wasn't excited either. She was simply existing. Her days followed the same gentle rhythm: coffee in the morning, a quiet walk in the afternoon, simple meals, long, quiet evenings. Evenings were the hardest, when the sun began to set and the house grew even quieter. She would turn on the television, not really to watch, but just to fill the silence. Her thoughts would drift back to years that felt closer than they should. The noise, the laughter, the feeling of being needed. That feeling was gone now. She wasn't lonely, but there was a kind of emptiness that sat quietly in the background of her life. And eventually, she stopped expecting anything more. No new beginnings, no unexpected moments, no changes. She told herself, "My story has already been written." And for a long time, she believed that. Until one afternoon, something small happened. Nothing dramatic, no big event, just a soft knock on her door. She paused, because at this stage of her life, unexpected things were rare. She stood up slowly, walked toward the door, and opened it. No one was there, just an envelope, placed neatly on the ground. She picked it up, and for a moment, she simply stared at it. Her name was written on the front, carefully, deliberately, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. Her heart shifted slightly, because no one sends letters anymore. Everything is messages, emails, quick calls, but this was something different, something intentional. For a second, she considered leaving it unopened, because sometimes the unknown feels easier when it stays unknown. But something about it felt important. So she walked back inside, sat down on the couch, and slowly opened it. Inside was a small piece of paper, just a few lines. She began to read. "I don't know if you remember me, but I never forgot you." Her breath caught. Time seemed to pause. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper. She read it again, then again, as if her mind needed a moment to catch up with what her heart had already felt. Because at 55, you don't expect the past to return. You don't expect unfinished stories to find their way back to you. But in that quiet living room, holding a letter she never expected, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not fear, but something softer, something deeper. Curiosity. And sometimes, curiosity is all it takes to change the direction of a life. Because in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Margaret realized something. Maybe her story wasn't over yet, and maybe this letter was just the beginning.
For a long moment, Margaret just sat there, holding the letter in her hands. The room was quiet, too quiet, but inside her, something had started to move. A memory, a feeling, something she hadn't touched in years. "I don't know if you remember me, but I never forgot you." She whispered the words softly, as if saying them out loud might help her understand them. But instead, they only made her heart beat a little faster. Who could it be? Her mind began searching through the past, carefully, slowly, like opening a box she had once sealed shut. Faces, names, moments, years of life passing through her thoughts, but none of them felt right. None of them felt like this, because this letter didn't feel casual. It felt intentional. She turned the paper over. Nothing else. No name, no number, just those words. And suddenly, the quiet life she had built so carefully didn't feel as steady anymore. It felt interrupted. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made her aware of something she had forgotten, that life could still surprise her. She stood up slowly, walked toward the window, and looked outside. Everything was the same: the street, the trees, the familiar silence. But inside her, nothing felt the same anymore, because one simple question kept repeating in her mind: who never forgot me? That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the letter resting on the table beside her. Her thoughts kept drifting back, further and further into the past, until suddenly one memory stopped her. Clear, unexpected. A name: Daniel. Her breath slowed, because she hadn't thought about him in decades. Not because he didn't matter, but because life had moved on, or at least she thought it had. Daniel wasn't part of her long marriage. He wasn't part of the life she built. He belonged to a much earlier chapter, a quieter one, a time when life felt open, uncertain, full of possibility. They had met when she was young, not in a dramatic way, just two people crossing paths at the right moment. He had a calm way of speaking, a thoughtful way of listening. Nothing about him was loud, but everything about him felt real. They weren't together for long. Life took them in different directions. Responsibilities came, choices were made, and slowly they lost touch. No big ending, no dramatic goodbye, just distance, and over time, silence. Margaret had never thought of it as something unfinished. She told herself that was just a part of life, and she moved on, built a family, lived her life. But now, lying there in the dark, holding a memory she hadn't visited in years, she felt something shift, because the letter felt like him. The simplicity, the honesty, the quiet weight of those words: I never forgot you. It didn't feel like something random. It felt like something that had waited. But why now? That question stayed with her, because timing changes everything. Why, after all these years? Why now, when her life had finally become calm? Why now, when she had stopped expecting anything new? The next morning, she made her coffee as usual, sat by the window as always, but nothing felt routine anymore. The silence felt different, not empty, but full of questions. She picked up the letter again, read it slowly, and for the first time she noticed something she had missed before. A small detail. At the bottom corner of the envelope there was a faint stamp, a city name. Her heart skipped slightly, because it wasn't random. It was the city where she had last seen Daniel. Suddenly, this wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was real. And with that realization came something she hadn't felt in years. Nervousness. Not fear, but that quiet, uncertain feeling that comes when life is about to change. She sat there for a long time, thinking, not about the past, but about what this could mean now. Because this letter wasn't just a letter, it was a door. And for the first time in years, Margaret had to decide something. Should she open it and step into something unknown, or close it and go back to the life she had already accepted? She took a deep breath, looked at the letter one more time, and quietly, almost to herself, she whispered, "Maybe." And sometimes one small maybe is where everything begins. For the rest of the morning, Margaret couldn't focus on anything. The house looked the same. The sunlight felt the same. The quiet remained. But inside her, everything had shifted. That one letter had opened something she thought was long gone. A memory, a feeling, a question. And now she had a choice. Ignore it and return to the life she had carefully accepted, or respond. She stood in the kitchen, holding her coffee, but not really drinking it. Her mind kept going back to one simple thought. What if it really is him? And right after that, another thought followed. What if it changes everything? She wasn't afraid of the past. She was afraid of what the past might bring into her present, because she had spent years building a life that felt safe, predictable, calm. And this was something else, uncertain. But at the same time, there was something quietly pulling her toward it. Not excitement, not longing, just curiosity, the kind that doesn't let you rest until you know the answer. By afternoon, she made a decision. Not a big one, not a dramatic one, just a small step. She sat down at her table, took out a blank piece of paper, and stared at it. For a long moment, she didn't write anything, because how do you respond to something like that? After all these years, what do you even say? Finally, she picked up the pen, and slowly she began to write. I don't know if this letter was meant for me, but something tells me it was. She paused. Her heart was beating just a little faster now, not from fear, but from stepping into something unknown. She continued, if this is who I think it might be, then yes, I remember. Her hand stopped again, because writing those words made it real. Not just a memory, a connection, still there after all this time. She didn't write too much. She didn't ask too many questions. Just enough, just honest. At the end, she added, Margaret. No pressure, no expectations, just an open door. She folded the paper carefully, placed it inside an envelope, and held it in her hands for a moment. This felt small, but it didn't feel small at all, because sometimes the smallest actions carry the biggest meaning. Later that afternoon, she walked to the mailbox, the same walk she had taken hundreds of times before, but this time every step felt different, slower, more aware. She stood there for a second, looking at the envelope in her hand, and a quiet thought crossed her mind. After this, there's no going back. Not because something bad would happen, but because something might change. And change, no matter how gentle, always asks something from us. She took a breath and placed the letter inside. The soft sound of it dropping felt louder than it should have. And just like that, it was done. There was nothing else to do now. No control, no certainty, just waiting. That evening, the house felt different again. Still quiet, but not empty. There was something in the air now, something she hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. She sat by the window, watching the sky slowly change color, and for the first time in a long time, her thoughts weren't about the past. They weren't about what she had lost. They were about what might be coming. Days passed. 1 day, 2 days, 3. No reply. And slowly, that familiar feeling started to return. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just a coincidence. By the 4th day, she told herself, it's okay. And in a way, it was, because even without an answer, something inside her had already changed. She had felt something again. She had opened a door she thought was closed forever, and that alone was more than she expected. But then, on the 5th morning, something happened. She opened her door, just like she always did, and there it was, another letter. Her name, the same handwriting. Her heart paused, because this time she knew. This wasn't just a memory anymore. This was real. And as she picked up the envelope, her hands slightly trembling, Margaret realized something quietly powerful. Some stories don't end. They just wait for the right moment to continue.
Margaret stood at the door, the letter still in her hands. For a moment, she didn't open it, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood something now. This letter could change everything. Once she read it, there would be no going back to the quiet life she had before. She walked slowly inside, sat down in the same place, and held the envelope gently. Her heart was steady, but deeper inside, there was something fragile. Hope. And hope, after a long time, can feel almost unfamiliar. She took a soft breath and opened the letter. Inside, a longer note this time. She began to read. Margaret. Her name, written so simply, but it carried something heavy. I wasn't sure if you would reply. She paused, because neither was she. But I'm glad you did. A small smile touched her face. He continued, I've thought about writing to you for years. Years. That word stayed with her, because it meant something real. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't random. This had been waiting. But I didn't know if I should disturb your life. Margaret looked down at the page, because that line felt like it understood her quiet, her routine, her carefully built peace. I didn't know what your life had become. Another pause. I didn't know if you would even remember me. She let out a soft breath, because she had remembered. Not clearly, not every detail, but enough. Enough to feel it again. He wrote, but I never forgot you. There it was again, not as a question this time, as a truth. She kept reading, not because of what we had. Her eyes slowed, but because of what we never finished. Her heart tightened gently, because that was something she had never allowed herself to think about, unfinished things. What we had was quiet, he wrote, but it was real. She closed her eyes for a moment, because that was exactly how she remembered it. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just real. He continued, life took us in different directions. She nodded slightly. It had. You built a life. So did I. A soft pause in her chest. And I never tried to change that. There was no regret in his words, no bitterness, just acceptance. But some connections don't disappear. She looked at that line longer than the others, because something inside her understood it. They just wait.
Silence filled the room again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of something she hadn't felt in years. Meaning. He continued, "I'm not writing to change your life." Her shoulders softened. "I'm writing because I wanted you to know," a pause, "that you mattered." Her eyes filled slightly, because sometimes those simple words carry the most weight. "You still do." She placed her hand gently over the paper, not to hide the words, but to hold them, to feel them. "To me," he finished. There was no pressure, no expectation, no request. Just honesty, just truth. Margaret sat there quietly, the letter resting in her hands. Her mind wasn't racing, her heart wasn't overwhelmed. Everything felt still, but not empty. For the first time in years, she felt something different. Not excitement, not confusion, something deeper. Connection. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Like something that had never really left, just been silent. She looked around her home, the same walls, the same quiet, but now it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like space, space for something new. She folded the letter slowly, held it close for a moment, and then whispered softly, almost to herself, "Why now?" But somewhere inside, she already knew the answer. Because sometimes life doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what you're finally ready for. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about the past returning. Maybe this was about something new, quietly beginning.
For the next few days, Margaret kept thinking about the letter. Not constantly, not obsessively, but quietly, like a thought that returns when everything else becomes still. She read his words more than once, not to analyze them, but to feel them, because there was something different about this. It wasn't about the past. It wasn't about regret. It wasn't about what could have been. It was about something simple, being remembered and being seen after all these years. One afternoon, her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. Unknown number. At this stage of her life, unexpected calls were rare, but something inside her said, "Answer it." So she did. "Hello?" There was a brief pause, and then a familiar voice, soft, calm. "Margaret?" Her heart paused, not in shock, but in recognition. "Daniel," she said quietly. There was silence for a moment. Not awkward, just real. "I wasn't sure if I should call," he said. "I wasn't sure if I'd be disturbing your life." Margaret smiled softly. "You're not." And for the first time in a long while, she meant it. They didn't talk for long, just a simple conversation. How life had been, where they were now. No heavy emotions, no pressure. Just two people, reconnecting. Before the call ended, he asked something gently. "Would you like to meet?" The question was simple, but the meaning behind it wasn't. Margaret didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood what that question carried. This wasn't just meeting someone. This was stepping into something unknown, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. But instead of fear, she felt something else, calm, and that surprised her. "I think I would," she said softly. A few days later, they met. Not somewhere special, just a small cafe. Quiet, warm, simple. She arrived first, sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her heart steady, not racing, just aware. Then the door opened, and there he was. Older, of course, so was she, but something about him felt exactly the same. The way he looked at her, the way he smiled, not with excitement, but with recognition. He walked toward her, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other, not as strangers, not as people trying to impress, but as two people who had once known each other and somehow still did. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," she replied. They sat down, and the conversation began, easy, natural, like no time had passed. They talked about life, the years in between, the paths they had taken, the people they had become. There was no rush, no pressure to define anything, just presence. At one point, Daniel looked at her and said quietly, "I never expected this." Margaret smiled. "Neither did I." And in that moment, she realized something deeply important. This wasn't about starting over. This wasn't about replacing the past. This wasn't about chasing something lost. This was about something new, something that had come at the right time. Later, as they walked outside together, the evening light soft around them, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not fear, peace. Because this time, there were no expectations, no pressure to make it perfect, no need to prove anything. Just two people choosing to see what this could become. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret understood something beautiful. Life doesn't end at a certain age. Love doesn't belong only to the young. And sometimes, the most meaningful chapters don't begin at the start. They begin later, when you are calmer, wiser, ready. As she looked at him, walking beside her, she didn't think about the past. She didn't think about the years in between. She only thought about one simple truth. It's not too late. And that thought changed everything. Because at 55, Margaret didn't find her past again. She found something else, a new beginning. And sometimes, that's even more beautiful.